I guess any business that you decide to start, like you have to be willing to stick with it indefinitely. It's not this like 5-year flash in the pan and then off you go and do something else. It's like you've really got to love it. And I think that testament, particularly in food, is like, do you still eat your product every day? And for me, it's like basically runs through my veins at this point.
Welcome to the podcast, Pippa. How are you doing?
Yeah, really good. Thank you.
So it'd be great to start with the beginning of your story, really. How did the idea for Pippa Nut begin?
Yeah. So Pippa Nut, we've been going for about 10 years now. We had our 10-year birthday in January, which was an amazing milestone. So feels like a long time ago, that first idea. But yeah, I guess about 12 years ago, probably the first kind of spark kind of emerged at that point. And for context, I was about 24 at the time. I wasn't in food and drink at all. So I was working in the creative arts, kind of as a theatre producer of all things. I'd had a pretty short career before jumping into starting up my own business. And for me, I wasn't in the industry that I launched into. I wasn't really from a business background. So for me, I really came at it from a own personal need, from a real like consumer point of view. I was doing lots of marathon training at the time. I'm still a keen runner now, and back then in particular, I was looking at like what kind of food could I use to kind of supplement my diet, and nearly every time my like go to post run treat was always like peanut butter on toast or something of that ilk. And yeah, I just really fell in love with the product, if I'm honest. It was a very like I'm a real foodie from by background, a kind of big family. So like food has always been like the center of my like upbringing. So I think it was definitely pulling on that thread. But this particular product got under my skin because I guess back then when I was just shopping for products, as you do, nearly every single product that I picked up back then in this particular category in peanut butter, 9 times out of 10 they contain palm oil, and a lot of them are really processed as well. That kind of coupled with that, it was kind of that Americanized sort of product, and I kind of felt a bit dissatisfied by it because I could see it was like this quite good product. It was like natural, or kind of got peanuts and almonds and things like that. But the fact that it was sort of mixed with things that I didn't think need to be in there really sat badly with me. And I could see it was like a kind of bubbling trend as well, like nut butters and sort of protein nuts. Fats were in, sugars were kind of more out. Education around what healthy and good food meant was kind of shifting, I think, at that particular moment in time, certainly for me as well as an individual. And yeah, I think it was like a number of those threads that kind of pulled together that made me think there's definitely a brand in here in this relatively dusty category. Because if you think about where peanut butter sits in store, it's normally like right at the back of the supermarket amongst jams and lemon curds and stuff. Yeah, it was this kind of like slightly under the surface trending product. But I could see a gap for like something that was more natural, that didn't contain palm oil, that had like a really like taste-driven brand associated with it. One that kind of appealed to kind of more of a younger consumer, one more like me. And it was that really. And I having not really known how food is made in supermarkets, it's always a bit of a mystery, I think. I literally bought a blender and a load of nuts, and I started making them in my kitchen initially, and I took them to Maltby Street Market, which is a market in sort of South London. And yeah, I trialed them at the weekends. So I'd make them in my evenings, and I'd go to markets on a Saturday, Sunday, and that's how I tested it. And it was like that kind of really got the ball rolling, like having a physical kind of basic product to kind of see what people thought. And it was, I think, that moment then that I kind of at market stalls, I was like, there's something in this. And I decided to kind of figure out how to scale it up. And that's kind of the beginning, I guess.
Nice. Had you had ideas before this or a desire to be an entrepreneur, or was this the starting moment?
This probably was like I didn't have a lot of ideas actually for this particular product. I when I was figuring out I knew I kind of wanted to get into sort of running my own business. There was I think in my very short career, I definitely had a streak in me that wanted to kind of set my own path. There was definitely something in that I found sometimes the thought of almost climbing the ladder almost harder than the idea of like starting my own thing. And I think I was really inspired by the food scene in London. And so I think when I was really storming and forming the idea, for a while I was like dabbling with the idea of having a food truck or something of that. Like there's like a food trucks were becoming really popular at that time, and I really loved all the markets and stuff like that in London that kind of really kind of, I don't know, brought it to life, I think. So that was a definite like route that I explored. But in the end, what I loved about kind of having a physical product and also something that you sell through retail is that, you have the ability to kind of do more with your brand once it's kind of a national brand. Like, and what I mean by that is that you have the ability to shift behaviors in a bigger way in terms of, certainly from a kind of health point of view, and also from a brand, the way you build a brand, and whether with different marketing activities you do, that you can bring all of that theatre that kind of food trucks kind of bring, I guess, to some level. So in short, actually, this was like one of the only ideas I really have had. I mean, since then, there have been other things that bubble around in my mind, but for whatever reason, this particular idea, I got really obsessed by it. And I think, yeah, it was definitely one of those things that I felt that if I didn't do it, there was definitely somebody else that was going to do it. So it's a strange one. I didn't think it wasn't something I brainstormed 100 ideas, and this was then the last one on the pile. It was like the idea, but how it's evolved, I guess, has kind of shifted and changed.
Were you worried that someone was going to get to it before you did if you didn't act?
Yeah, definitely. And I think I'd been over to the States and stuff, and I'd seen sort of like the category over there and the different brands on the shelf. And so, and it was much more evolved over there because they're like the home of peanut butter, if you like. And yeah, I kind of felt like this category was sort of waiting for someone to disrupt it. And I always like the idea of, I once got told that you either create a whole new category in itself, in this particularly thinking about food. So you might be in the next coconut water brand, and you build it from the ground up, or you kind of reinvent something that's already existing, and you kind of take a new angle at it, and sort of make it even better. So and that was what I felt like, this category hadn't really been touched. And like, look, if I walk around supermarkets now with that kind of lens, like, you can spot little places and
Mm.
gaps now, I think, when I'm a bit more tuned into it. But back then, I just happened to also just be a real fan of this particular product. I loved what it kind of did for me as a consumer, and I kind of felt like I could. There was a real foodie angle to it, like, nut butters. You can add lots of different flavors. You can have a lot of fun with it. So it really played to my kind of creative side, my foodie side. So yeah, there was sort of a number of reasons why I guess that was the idea that kind of niggled.
Match made in heaven, all your different passions and everything
Yeah,
coming
it did.
together.
It did pull a lot of things together for me. Yeah, it's a great product, and I was just saying before we started speaking, like that. I still eat it every day, and it's like, I guess any business that you decide to start, like, you have to be willing to stick with it indefinitely. It's not this like 5-year flash in a plan and then off you go and do something else. It's like you've really got to love it, and I think that testament, particularly in food, is like, do you still eat your product every day? And for me, it is through. It's like basically runs through my veins at this point. I'm half peanut butter.
75% peanut butter, yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
So how long did you do the market stalls before you moved into retail?
Yeah, so I always knew this brand wasn't a market store brand. I wanted it to be in retail. Like, I always had a vision that I wanted it to be a national brand, but market stores are great test beds. So I did it for about 4 months. Did it all throughout winter, which I think added a bit of grittiness. It was cold, so if I was willing to still stick with it by like end of February, I think there was something in the idea. And I think that 4 months, to be honest, I could have done it for longer, and I really enjoyed it. But it gave me enough of what I needed to see, which was some immediate feedback on the recipes. So you got a good feel of like what was kind of like, what do people like about it, what they didn't, in terms of immediate feedback when you're sampling what products sold. It just gave you a bit of a flavor, I guess, of like what it was like to kind of run this on a really like micro scale. And yeah, over that time, I'd like tweaked the recipes, and it definitely made me kind of clear about what were going to be the 3 or 4 recipes that I would then launch with. And to be honest, I think a big bit of it is just confidence. Like, it gave me a bit more confidence at that particular moment in time, because I think for someone that hadn't worked in food and drink, who hadn't run a business, the idea of going from nothing physical, like, to then buying 50,000 units, felt like a big jump for me. So for whatever reason, I felt the need to have a few stepping stones in between. So I don't think it's a necessity that when you have a food brand or a drink or whatever, that you have to go and test it at market stores. But I found that like gave me more of the confidence to do more of it, and take bigger risks that perhaps if you'd worked in the industry, you'd kind of feel more comfortable with.
How nervous were you on your first day at the market stall when you rocked up with your product?
Yeah, it is very. You feel self-conscious. You feel almost a little bit silly as well sometimes. I remember particularly in the early days, when I'd speak to people about the product and brand, particularly when you called it a brand. Felt almost like you're masquerading a little bit because it's like really at this point you don't really have a brand. It's just this product that you're kind of like tinkering around with. And yeah, there's like nervousness that like people are gonna like laugh at you, and you are asking people to spend. They were quite expensive on the market, so they're like $4.99 for a little jar. Like, so you are actually asking for quite a lot. So there is a bit of like, I think every time you step out and do something when you're in those early stages, you are exposing, I guess, the idea and putting yourself open to critique and criticism, which I definitely was nervous about. But to be honest, once you get out there, it's like really fun, and that's almost the validation that I needed. Was I enjoyed it. Like, I enjoyed seeing people's reactions to the product. I even enjoyed it when people didn't like it because it was quite funny. Like, in terms of the kind of feedback that
Mm.
people give, because when people try something at a market, they'll put it in their mouth and they'll turn to their mate normally and they'll be like, either make a face and be like, "Oh no, thank you." Like, and it's almost like you've got to treat it as like,
Just pour my heart and soul into that
yeah, it's
product.
just what it is. So yeah, I think it's like a mixture, isn't it? But I think the act of doing often for me is like will quell those nerves. So yeah, it was a mixture, I think, at those times.
And so you got the ball rolling with the market stores. When was the breakthrough where you were able to get it onto shelves?
Yeah, so it's probably from the idea that I'd had to actually getting it onto like retail shelves and the kind of packaging that you see kind of today. It took about 2 years. So from market stores, it was then like finding a factory, of which that is a bit of a needle in the haystack, particularly if you don't know this sector at all. That took about 8 months to even just find the factory, and it was endless no's about trying to find somebody that had the capability and the appetite to kind of take on a new brand. And then obviously the recipe development through their factory site as well. And then came the branding and the packaging, which took another few months. And then I raised a little bit of capital to kind of get, the brand kind of almost give me a year's runway basically out the door. So I raised about £120,000 on Crowdcube. And yeah, and then really that was like 2 years. And I thought I'd do it in a year. I think
Mm.
when I first had the idea, I was like, oh, it'll take me a year. And even at that year, I thought I'd launch into like Waitrose from day dot. I launched into Selfridges, which wasn't bad, but it wasn't like an immediate like open door to a national retailer. That took some time of proving the brand in the market, even after that point. So always takes longer, particularly with food, because there's aspects around shelf life testing and things like, and packaging takes time to print, all of that stuff, which has lead times.
If you were to do it again with the knowledge you have now, how
Mm.
quickly do you think you could do it?
Yeah, I mean, we develop stuff all the time now. Now I think I could do it in a year, but it really depends on how complex the supply chain is and how complex the product. With anything, particularly if you're doing something more innovative, do not rush the process, because the more you can try and get it in front of consumers and get feedback and make sure you do the right steps from a technical supply chain, all the food safety stuff, like, you'll be able to run faster if you do the work up front. And obviously there's an element of like, don't over egg the pudding sort of thing, but don't don't think that you have to get so fast to market that someone else is going to beat you there. Like, because if you do it properly, then you'll beat them anyway in the market. So yeah, I'm a believer in, yeah, have some pace, but don't like rush it to the point where you try to launch something that's half cooked and you've got a crap product that then nobody buys, and then you have to reformulate, and you've lost the window, you've lost trust with retailers, all of that. So yeah, it's a tension. And even to be honest, even now when we're developing stuff, we're having that constant tension of like, how fast are we willing to move,
Mm.
versus like just getting that product on the shelf and getting it in the market, because also there's an element of like, you learn a lot through it being in the
Mhm.
market. So it's a real fine balance. But food, unlike probably some sort of service-based industries and things like that, it really is in the eating. And if it tastes like crap, like honestly, you'll just not get out the door. Like, it'll fail within 6 months. So you've got to be really honest with yourself. That's my probably main advice, I think, is in food in particular.
Go a little bit slower to get a bit further.
Yeah, exactly.
So the 8 months you said for the manufacturing, how did you find a manufacturer in the end? And then also, how did you find the branding agency? Because that's obviously such a fantastic part of your business.
Yeah, so manufacturing is definitely a bit of a needle in a haystack. I thought when I started to approach people that people would queue out the door to work with this like innovative brand that is like super new and fresh and exciting. But in reality, manufacturers want like high volume, simple, efficient lines that kind of run for as many hours as possible, without added extra complexity of like, different flavors and formats and packaging types, etc. So that was a quick, hard truth that I learned right at the start. Finding the factory was, I think, what I did when I started the business wouldn't be kind of how I would do it now. Back then it was like a kind of real kind of sending emails out into the abyss and calling people up and seeing, running through very long lists of manufacturers and literally just going row by row down to see, do you make peanut butter? Can you handle nuts in your factory, et cetera, et cetera. And you get a lot of no's, and eventually I found a yes through lots of different kind of asking for that manufacturer. If they said no, do you know anyone else, and that kind
Hmm.
of ricochet. And now I think you can find and work with kind of food developers who are specialists in those areas, who often have quite good networks of manufacturers that they work with. That might come at a marginal cost, but it could save you 5 months of searching. So it depends whether or not you're willing to kind of sort of outsource little bits, if you know what I mean. And I think as well, like, the key bit that I mentioned there is, which I kind of learned a bit too late, I think, when I was doing the work, was making sure that you do ask, every time you get a no, ask, who else can I approach, and using that as a good method. Because often, factories don't really mind talking about someone else. If they don't want the business, they'll pass you on to someone else. So I think that's quite a good way. But there's all sorts of things. There's like trade events that you can go to where you can go and walk the aisles and talk to different manufacturers who are exhibiting, to working with different consultancies, or literally Googling. Sometimes a Google search can genuinely bring up the right partner in the end. So yeah, but it is inevitably always going to be a little bit of a needle in a haystack for sure.
And then on the branding side, did that come after the crowdfunding campaign?
So I approached that a little bit different. So once I'd secured the factory and I was like, right, I've got a commercially scalable product, that's when I started to look at packaging. And I didn't really have any money at the time to invest in branding. And I've always been a big believer in that creative, like, is a really, particularly, I mean, the whole brand is built around the identity, and it's what you're ultimately building. Or the product has to be great, but the brand is what you're building. So it was probably the one thing I was not willing to compromise on in terms of cutting corners, if you like, and working maybe for either freelancers or smaller agencies. I wanted to work with really good packaging agencies who really knew their craft. So I approached a few, but met one particular agency who I really had a good rapport with, and they got what I was about, got what the brand was going to kind of visually be, hopefully at some point. And I actually did an equity deal with them. They did a certain amount of work, predominantly create the identity, the logo, the packaging, and get it kind of ready to launch, and all the artworking. And that was a bit of equity that I gave at the start. So they were actually my first investors
Wow.
before I went on to do a Crowdcube. So in many ways, it was the most expensive bit of equity that I gave away. On the benefit, it depends how you think about the value of what they've helped me build. So the identity of the logo of what Pippa Nut, looks like, hasn't changed at all in those like 10 years. So they really set me up with something brilliant. And they've been great partners for the last 10 years as well. So, you've got some really good kind of support and kind of people plugged into your brand. So whether I would do that again, if I had money, I probably wouldn't, but I didn't at the time. And it was like, I had nothing of nothing at that point, and I had no additional money to be able to kind of pay for any kind of branding. So it worked for me at the time to get this brand out the door. So it was the right choice, I think. And I still stand by that even now.
Awesome. Am I able to ask the name of the business?
Yeah, they're called B&B Studios. Yeah, I'm sure they'd love the plug.
Yeah, I was just
But they
thinking.
are brilliant. They are great and it's the key thing, I think, with any agency is, like, obviously work with the specialists that know their area, and they are all about packaging. And so they are great at creating particularly commercial products. Like, not some they can do very premium stuff too, but I think that's also what you're kind of looking for, is someone that can translate into kind of something that's retail ready, that's going to really stand out in a environment where, there's so much noise on the shelf.
So you've test trade on the market stall, you've got the manufacturer on board, you've got the solid brand on board, and then was it the Crowdcube campaign?
Exactly. And
Yeah.
then I was like, right, I need a little bit of money to actually pay for the stock, because at the time I was buying stock up front. So I had no terms with my manufacturer, which isn't uncommon, I think, when you're starting. It's just a bit painful, so you've always got a bit of a cash flow piece. And I knew that my first order was about 40 grand. So I kind of couldn't, again, afford it off I'd already by this point, credit cards were like maxed out. I'd, got a startup loan and all of these things. So yeah, I was kind of stretched my limit. So I went out looking for about 100 grand, and I pitched to, I don't know, probably about, I wouldn't say it was probably about 70 odd investors, because I did lots of kind of big pitches to get private investment initially. I thought I'd get a couple of angels to kind of fund the 100 grand that I needed, but everyone said no. I had
Really?
nobody that really wanted to put the full amount in. I had a few people that were like, I'll sling you 10, maybe 15, but nobody was willing to chuck 50 to 100 grand at it. So, and then by this point, I was getting impatient, and I was like, you know what, I'll pull the trigger on crowdfunding, and I'll pull all those people that said 5, 10 grand. Yeah, maybe I'll give you that. And I kind of pushed them towards this crowd platform, which was, I guess, like an elaborate friends and family round. Before then, the crowd then took over. So yeah, it wasn't actually the route that I initially wanted to go down. The benefit of crowdfunding was that got about 70 investors into the
Mm.
investors, the kind of armchair investors. And they predominantly just left me alone, which in lots of ways was like the best gift ever for your first 2, 3 years. Yes, you want good advice, and we talk about that later, but you don't want to be bogged down in doing board decks or reporting, or having, an investor throw you an idea that you then feel obliged to do because they've put money into your brand. So actually, in lots of ways, it gave me kind of freedom to be very sort of drive it myself. And the cash came in pretty quick. I raised that 120 grand in about 7 days on the site. So you typically have 60 days to raise the money. So it was really fast, and actually quite an enjoyable process in the end. But back to your point on like feeling exposed, or those moments where you kind of feel like very anxious, pressing go on that crowdfunding was one of those moments, because you could get complete crickets, and then it's a really public embarrassing failure to everyone that you've like, because you also have to shout about it as loudly as you possibly can to try and pull in those people. So again, I remember feeling pretty anxious, particularly on like day 3, 4, when it slowed down for a bit, and I was like, oh man, it's going to take the whole 60 days to fund this, but and then sped back up again. So yeah, it was quite nerve wracking.
Do you have a percentage of that investment lined up already from the angels you'd
Yeah,
approached? Roughly how much?
I think I'd had conversations with a fair few, and I think I'd about 50% of it was
Okay,
already
so
pre lined
still
up.
nervy.
But
Still,
still
yeah.
nervy in the sense that I didn't know if they would genuinely follow
Yeah.
through, and some of them didn't. Some of them didn't, but enough of them kind of. My friend said it's a bit like, when you wait in a queue and stuff, and if there's 3 queues, you always end up wanting to join the longest queue because you think that's the best one. I feel like the same mentality is with crowdfunding. Like, once it gets to a certain amount, people just think that it's good enough. Everyone else has vested it, which sometimes is questionable with crowdfunding, but and people follow. So you just need to get enough up front so that it feels like there's a bit of momentum, and then really there was a good proportion of people who I've still never met, who I still don't really know who they
Wow.
are, but they're on the cap table.
Still part of the community.
Yep, still part of the community, hopefully still buying the product. So that's also a good thing.
And from the crowdfunding round, did you emerge with any advisors, mentors, people with industry experience you could rely upon?
Yeah, so there've definitely been people who I've sort of more informally kind of kept in touch with, but actually less in the way of industry experts. And really, that original crowdfund was sort of the cash I needed to buy the stock and all of that. But then I kind of plugged in people around the sides that I felt were the real advice that I wanted to lean on. And so after I kind of completed that crowdfunding raise, I one of my main investors now, but started out as a mentor, was a guy called Giles Brook, and I approached him directly. And actually, I'd approached him about a year before that to kind of have a few conversations and see whether or not he'd want to get involved in some way or another. And he kind of had ignored me, and it didn't ever hear anything back from that email. And then once I'd kind of done the work, I'd got the brand up and running and all kind of almost ready to go, and the crowdfund had completed. I then reached out to him and said, like, would you be interested in at least mentoring me, and sort of seeing where it went, basically. And he then responded. And Giles, he used to work. He was like the general manager at Innocent, and then he started up. He kind of took Vita Coco, which is the coconut water brand, across Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And he was a co-founder in Bare Nibbles at the time. So he was really like, he was a heavyweight when it came to FMCG. And he was exactly the experience I needed in terms of he is very commercial. He's got a good rounded approach, but he's commercial by background. So all those things that I knew I was weaker on, which was, the P&L and what terms does Tesco expect and how do you deal with, Sainsbury's when they say X, Y, or Z. He was able to kind of really coach me day to day, and has been like a really critical person on the journey, and now is invested afterwards as well. So kind of again helped fund the brand over the last few years.
In practice, did that look like you getting in touch when there were issues that you weren't sure about? Or was that a regular mentoring type relationship?
Yeah, my experience with mentors is that every person is different in the way that they like to work with individuals. So I've had mentors who it has been more formal, and you almost sit down, you schedule those meetings, and you kind of come with a good agenda, and the person might be prepared with what it is that you want to talk about. Giles is definitely not one of those people. In fact, I tried to kind of make it quite a structured approach, and having now worked with him for 10 years, like he is more someone that responds very well, and I really like this about him. More of a WhatsApp or quick call. Like, yes, we have sometimes more formal meetings to talk about stuff. He's my chairman now, so that comes by the nature of the job. But really, the majority of in those early years of working with him was like, I don't know, it was a WhatsApp. Giles have got Sainsbury's has said that they're open to have a conversation. Like, okay, can we sit and go through the P&L with Sainsbury's, and you can let me know if I've put the margin structure right and the promotional plan's good, and have I got the right customer investment in? And he would literally just line by line coach me through it. So it was quite heavy duty at points, and he really did lean in on some scenarios where like manufacturers were messing me around, and he would sometimes actually help me in terms of call them up and stuff. I mean, that was sort of when he was a bit more invested, but in the early more mentoring side of it, and yeah, he really, really rolled up his sleeves. And I know that mentoring is meant to sometimes there's a blurry line between sometimes coaching and mentoring, but mentoring is more him downloading his experience. But there is also a bit about I find when you're learning your craft is like sometimes you need to be shown tools or frameworks or a P&L, and you need a bit more like context. It's not just purely just words. There is sometimes also like follow-ups and sort of information that is given if you've got the right mentoring relationship set up, because some of it is quite tricky, I guess, to get your head around, and there's complexity when it comes to commercial modeling and things like that, which I needed a lot of support on. But yeah, he basically taught me everything I know about food and drink, and then until I had enough of a kind of my sort of knees under the table to feel confident that I could like then carry on.
Set you free and then off you
Exactly,
go.
it's let me go.
And then once you say, then you've gone, I guess, through this journey where it's really grown into a big business.
Mm.
Along that way, how have you decided to bring other people on board so that you haven't got too many people clouding your judgment, but you're adding value as and when it's needed?
Yeah. And I definitely think there are different mentors for different stages of the journey. So even before Giles, by the way, there was people that I leaned on when I was sort of just figuring out the early literal getting the product ready for market. Had one particular mentor at that time who was brilliant at
Mm.
that, getting shit done when you're literally needing to get the product out the door. Giles was great for like almost once the brand was ready to launch and I was going to start having commercial conversations, and there was sort of like the practical side of like building the brand. And then more recently, certainly have had a kind of rethink about who are the people that are feeding into me. How can I get sort of sometimes more experts? So, for instance, actually, kind of one of the things I was looking at, which I say they're non-exec directors, but they act as mentors. They're kind of similar in my mind in terms of the kind of advice they give. But more recently, I brought in, for instance, a chief marketing officer who really gives me a level of like, specific knowledge on brand and marketing that I, didn't necessarily have as much from Giles. Or I've also brought someone on that's, slightly different sector, but has a bit more deeper experience in, say, D2C. So I think there's also those general business coaches that can give you good big business acumen. And then there's some of the specialists that you need to actually kind of help you on some of the kind of nitty gritty on certain areas that you're focusing on, whether it's marketing ops, finance, whatever it is. So I think, yeah, over the years, I've kind of lent on different things. But as the brand has got bigger, sometimes I've also wanted to have like more specifics because
Mhm.
I've got quite a good understanding of how the brand, what, I know what I'm doing now from a broad business point of view. Actually, sometimes it is like the detail that I want. Um, and yeah, the final thing I guess is like mentoring. I think always complements with like things like coaching, and I think coaching is quite different when it comes to sort of what you're looking to get out of it. That is when you're really you're leading the kind of search for the answers, and your coach is there to kind of pull it out of you, rather than a mentor kind of gives more of their experience. And I definitely think in terms of leadership, which I think has been a big journey for me in learning how to lead a team and get comfortable in my own skin, coaching has been the thing there that has really kind of unlocked that, because it requires, I guess, certain skill, I think, to kind of get that out of people.
So is that a regular coach that you see that helps specifically with leadership?
Yeah, and she's a woman called Karen, and I've had her in chunks at different points. So again, it's similar to mentors. There are times where you're kind of fine and you're kind of flying and you're just doing your own thing. You don't think you always need someone every single week to month. And I'd say similar for me, at least with coaching, has been pulses. When I've felt I'm going through an extra bit of stretch, or when the business is going through an extra bit of stretch, then that's often when I really start to reach out a bit more to people that where I'm looking to kind of plug gaps or get advice. So coaching for me, particularly when the brand went from a team of about sort of seven, so pretty small, to suddenly I was sort of leading maybe 15 to 17 people. And there was a leadership team that I was starting to build in. So I started to have like a head of marketing and a head of sales. And I'd never managed anyone before I started the business. And I'd never really seen leadership in a way that I could help model. So I was slightly flying blind in terms of how I showed up every day.
Hmm.
And I had massive amounts of insecurity, I think, around like my style as a leader, and my ability to lead experienced people. And that was like some of the things that I needed to kind of overcome at that moment in time. And then now, like coaching, again, I tend to find it's often quite goal orientated. So even now, if there's something that I'm particularly wanting to focus on, perhaps it might be like, how do I sort of get better at landing, more constructive feedback, and sort of be more direct, as an example. Maybe that's something that I might want to work on with a coach through like real life scenarios where I'm kind of trying to figure out how do I want to sort of tackle those sort of things. So yeah, I think for me it works best in chunks. But I know, friends of mine have got like coaches that they meet almost every month, and that's almost like you would have a therapist. It's someone that you're there to like lean on. Whereas I felt like it's more kind of focused pieces of work.
And you mentioned leadership on your journey. What have you learned about leadership, or what do you think makes a good leader now?
Yeah, I think for me, a good leader is all about knowing yourself. Again, in many ways, much like therapy, when you're trying to, work on your personal relationships, I think coaching's the kind of working side of it. I think if you really understand, um, you can be a great leader when things are going well. When things aren't going so well, that's when you normally your kind of reactive tendencies, or the things that don't necessarily serve you so well, tend to pop up. That's when stress is triggered. Most people will start to show things about themselves that are perhaps not as strong in terms of from a leadership point of view. And so understanding what happens to you when you're under pressure, under stress, what are the things that therefore you need to work on. So for instance, I don't know, mine might be when things are going wrong, I want to go in and fix it all,
Hmm.
which isn't really going to get the best from your team if you're there like wading in and getting, in the detail, and really getting in people's way. So I think the more you can have like awareness of like what happens, both in terms of what are your strengths, but also the flip side of that, what are the areas where you have weaknesses, particularly when you're under stress, when therefore you're not as controlled and considered. I think makes a great leader when they're able to be sort of consistent every single day, as opposed to one day you're flying and the next you're not, because different things are happening and you're maybe under pressure, if that makes sense. So for me, that's a big part of it, knowing yourself and therefore being consistent. And I think I'm a big believer in sort of being very open with your team, like sharing things as they are, sharing almost how you're making decisions, bringing people on the journey with that. I think makes a really good leader, tends to get better buy-in when you are more open with um, why you've made certain decisions, and there's a sense of transparency, because I think that builds trust overall. Yeah, those would be, I guess, two of the things that I lean on the most.
Awesome. And I know the food industry with challenger brands, there's often quite a lot of young founders coming up.
Yeah.
How do you immerse yourself in the sort of peer industry amongst other founders?
Yeah, yeah, in terms of learning, and also trying to, when you're figuring things out on the fly. So I don't know, a good live example is like we're doing a 3PL tender, we're our logistics provider. If you can fire out to like five people that are trusted friends in your industry, of like, who do you use? Do you rate them? Would any other things you want me to know about them? You can find yourself getting a shortlist, for instance, really quickly without having to have done like loads of heavy work. So over the years, I've got, a few trusted, like close friends who are on WhatsApp. We meet for lunch every quarter, and we tend to just share about what's going on with our businesses and things that we're reading that we're finding interesting, or podcasts that we think we should listen to. And they're actually a group of fellow food entrepreneurs. They're also female entrepreneurs, and they're like my tight group. And then there's the myriad of other people that you kind of know who are like mates, but maybe not people you meet regularly. And then again, I think it's sort of sometimes there's a tendency you feel like you're wasting time when you're like investing in going for that coffee or going for dinner with so and so. But I do think do invest that time, because over time you build this incredible network, which becomes quite a valuable asset. And it makes the journey more fun, to be honest. If you've got people that who are quite close, but also just generally a sense that there are other people that you could lean on for advice. But importantly, I think in this is like, yes, your peer network are there to, hopefully when something goes wrong, you can call them up and ask their advice. But prioritizing, making sure you also give back is, I think, a really important thing. So I make a point, if someone reaches out to me for advice or something that they need, I will get back to them immediately. I'll put it to the top of my list, normally because I think it will otherwise, I'll forget about it. But also I think there's something about like, I value people who get back to me really quickly, who send me this, I don't know, job spec if I need one, and or an intro to this person, they turn it around really quickly, because it then flows back to you as well. So I think give out as much as you give as you take, if not more, because yeah, I think that sets you up, I think, for more of a, I don't know, your peers become closer, I guess, in that respect.
On the topic of advice, and I'm sure you get asked loads of things about being a founder in the food industry, what would you say to founders listening that are thinking about starting a food business are the best and the worst bits about that type of business?
Um, I think in terms of, let's start with the worst, and so we can end
Yeah,
on a
another
high.
high.
um, yeah, I think that the challenge in the food industry is, it's so exposing to turbulence, economic, environmental, macro things that you feel like you have very little control over. And in the UK, it is so competitive in retail that you are often quite squeezed. So I think the pressure you feel in terms of, when Brexit happened, we buy all of our almonds from California. All the dollar became really strong against the pound. We just suddenly lost loads of margin. Those sort of like big hits can make massive impacts, and you're often operating on relatively low margins, particularly when you're not at scale. So those sort of shocks, I think, can have a really seismic impact on your brand and your ability to actually even just trade. So I think that's, for me, the thing that I least enjoy is that sort of sense of, yeah, particularly in the last 5 years, like turbulence that you have to kind of ride out. Um, and I think starting a business more specifically, like downside, is both kind of what I love about it, but also what I find difficult sometimes, is the fact that you never switch off from it. Like, and you're always thinking, I'm always thinking about it. And it's also what I love about it, because I enjoy thinking about it. But there are some moments where I wish I could turn that part of my brain off, or that you could just go on holiday and genuinely just forget. Um, and so, but then I also think I kind of enjoy the kind of ticking over in my mind, and that cogitation that I have, or the fact that whenever I go into a Sainsbury's, I can't not browse the aisles and like look at who's on deal and what bit of media they bought, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of like, I like the fact it's a passion point as well. So that would be one of the things I'd put on the other side as well. And I guess For me, I always thought business was like very, well, at least what's it represented on TV and stuff was like all suits and briefcases and all of that. But it's a very creative industry, particularly in food. I mean, you are creating products like that is really very creative. And actually, how you solve problems is a very creative process. So when you do have those fires that you're putting out, I love that side of it in lots of ways. I get a real energy when like I feel a sense that I'm fixing things or like finding a way through the blockages. So I actually think what surprised me, I think, most in running a food brand, but also just generally business, is just how creative it is. And that's not just in marketing, that is in sales, that is in finance, that is in ops, because all of these things require you to like think smarter, faster, because you're the challenger brand who's got to do. I love the saying like 1 + 1 = 3. Like you have £1 and £1 and you have to make it make £3. And I love that problem solving across every bit of the business. So yeah, it'd be the fact that it is incredibly creative.
Awesome. And final question is, I guess, what's next? And also, will there be a 5 kilogram tub for me to have Pippa at home?
The 5 kilo, we can make that happen.
Yeah.
That is easy. In fact, that did actually come up recently. It was like, should we just make an even bigger tub? Like, because people love this
Monster tub.
stuff. Maybe watch this space. We are doing lots actually at the moment. So we're nut butter brand, but we've got lots of snacking products as well. So we're pushing quite a lot in that space, which is kind of carving out a new path for us, which is in a very competitive part of the store, which is all kind of the cereal bars and things like that. So there's lots to come in that, which we're working on. Sustainably wise, I'm a trustee at B Lab UK, B Corp, and yeah, we are going even deeper into like what we can do within our supply chain, which I'm really excited about from a regenerative agriculture point of view. And we're also should be launching soon some news around some of our charitable giving initiatives. So there's lots from a kind of how do you embed that I'm thinking about day to day, like how do you embed your purpose and your and impact into your business as much as you possibly can. So that's the thing that I'm finding really interesting, but it's probably less out in the ether at the moment. And yeah, we're doing a little bit of international at the moment. We've largely been focused on the UK, and this year we've just launched into Belgium. We're looking at a few other markets in Europe that we're sort of starting to open up. So that's kind of treading new ground, I guess, for us as well.
Nice. World domination.
Here we come.
Well, thank you so much. Like it's genuinely for me anyway, having started a food business, it's like watching a case study of what great can look like.
Mm,
So I'm sure it'll be inspiring to many others.
lovely. Thank you.